Tonight we're going to dive into a topic that we've been covering before, the Anunnaki. And our guest tonight is going to be Scott Allen Roberts, and he's the author of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, the untold story of fallen angels, giants on the earth, and their extraterrestrial origins. Now, as we get into this, what I would like to start off by doing is let's just read some passages from the Bible. And before I do that, I want to preface this. I find there's an interesting correlation between Scotty, we're going to be listening to tonight, and Zecharia Sitchin. I knew Sitchin personally on a professional level. We worked on a few things together. And both of these men were well advanced in their theological training. They were at, the equivalent of a seminary for both sides. And both of them hit the brick wall with their teachers and their institutions when they began asking questions about the Nephilim. It was just one of those, you don't do that kind of deals. And consequently, both of them went on a journey of exploration. Now, what really got them? All right, well, I'm going to read this to you because I think it's interesting. And frankly, I'm reading straight from the page on Wikipedia of all places. And here they say the term Nephilim occurs just twice in the Hebrew Bible, both in the Torah. That first is Genesis 6:1-4, immediately before the story of Noah's Ark. Let me read this. When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Operative word, any of them that they chose. Women obviously didn't have much of a voice in this. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The second reference is in Numbers 13:32-33, where the Hebrew spies report that they have seen fearsome giants in Canaan. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Wow. So, bottom line, the Bible's telling us that they go, yo, babe, you're mine, and that's it. I mean, it's right out of the caveman school of matrimony. Beat the woman on the head with a club, drag her into your cave, and bells will ring. All right? I'm sure you ladies out there are going, no, I don't really think that's how it works. All right. But the thing here is that when you talk about the Nephilim, you cannot help but talk about the Anunnaki, and that really brings us to the gist of what we're going to be doing here tonight, is that we're going to be talking about the Anunnaki. And a lot of folks have asked me over the years, why is it that I've really been focused on the sciences around proving the existence of Planet X, Nibiru, Destroyer, Frightener, it's got a lot of different names, and why I have sidestepped, for the most part, the issue of the Anunnaki. Well, I can tell you the principal reason was, while Sitchin was alive, I just considered it to be his pigeon. That was his ballywick, and leave him be to it. On the other hand, there was something else that I noticed, and it made me less interested in joining into the conversation, which seemed about competing ideas of who they are, the Anunnaki and the Nephilim. Is, for me, it always boils down to a real simple question. Once the music stops, who's left without a chair? Now, if we go back and we listen and read and investigate everything about the Anunnaki and the Nephilim, two things we know for sure: gold and women. Women, mentioned very clearly, all right, in the Bible, just as I've read it to you. Gold we know about also because it's what they use to repair their atmosphere. Now, for those of you out there going, gee, how can gold repair an atmosphere? Gold is a natural radiation shield. It's very good at it. If you look at our spacecraft that are out in space, they have a very thin gold foil. All right, and that gold foil has a tremendous amount of capability to resist radiation. If you look at a picture of an F-16 fighter, it's got a big bubble canopy that really gives the pilot an incredible view. But also these are high-flying jets. And so you'll notice that the canopy of an F-16 has a golden tone to it. It's because when they form the plexiglass, they actually embed gold into it so that the radiation that the pilots are getting at high altitude is not going to turn them into a big pile of cancer. So there's a real reason for having the gold. And obviously there's a reason for having the women. I mean, if we like Earth women, why wouldn't someone else? It seems to be a popular thing in the movies. And so I came across Scotty's book, and I have really been fascinated with how guys like Scotty get started, and they not only hit the brick wall inside of an institution, but then they push through that and they write a book, and they go start and talking about it, and they find an audience. It's quite an amazing thing. The curious thing for me is, why is it that even though this is mentioned directly in the Bible, in the Torah, this is a taboo topic for both Christians and Jews? Sitchin, he hit the wall with his religious training, and that's what got him going down the same route that Scotty did, and Scotty had it. Now, Scotty doesn't agree with Sitchin on quite a few things. He's got his differences. Hey, that's fine. If everyone was in lockstep, well, then we'd be looking like Nazi Germany if we were all in lockstep. And that's the beautiful thing about democracy. We can and do disagree with each other, and we agree to do it in a civil manner. So as we get into this, I want to explain to you that when I record my interviews, I do them offline because it gives me a really good chance to get into a lot of depth with my guests. There'll be a lot of comments that I'm doing when we're recording the session that I take that out. It's superfluous for you. But you get everything the guest is saying, other than maybe I take out an occasional stutter. But whatever the guest is saying, it's 100%. You get all the words. Me, I trim down. That's getting progressively easier, too. But anyway, when we started recording this, and Scotty has his own radio show, both of us have professional studios, and we're very, very well adept at working with all the bandwidth issues and working with Skype and connectivity and getting a recording. And what we found was that this topic, which is really going to be talking about women and gold, seemed to have drawn the ire of someone, and we were getting hammered again and again and again, 5 times, actually 6 times during the recording session, that we were being disconnected, not only on Skype, but then we tried doing it on landline phones, AT&T, good old POTS, plain old telephone system. We were getting slammed there. And so it was Scotty's idea to just, hey, this is weird stuff. It doesn't happen to him. It happens to me. But he said, hey, let's incorporate it into the show. So now when you hear this dial tone, I'll play this for you. All right. When you hear that in the recording, I'm actually putting that in so that you can tell when the show's been interrupted. Doing Skype, we don't have the dial tone issue. So with that, I am going to get right into it, and I see that there's a great active group out there in the virtual chat room. Oh, yeah, I can't wait to get in there and mix it up with y'all in the chat room. So in the meantime, hey, let's get go. Rise and fall of the Nephilim. Scott, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me, Marshall. Good to be here.
That's good to have you here because I'm getting more and more interested in this Nephilim story all the time. And your book is very challenging for people who have a purely biblical view, but it goes to the heart of the question. Does the Bible support the ancient alien theory? And for me, it's not so much about what's there, but what's not there. To me, The whole story of the Nephilim is like a picture puzzle. You know, you get it out of the box, you spread out all the pieces on the coffee table, and the first thing you do is you get those four corners, and then you work your way in. The problem is for doctrinal thinkers, people that are very limited in what they're allowed to read and think about it, for them, it's like trying to work that same puzzle, but with only one corner piece.
Right.
And the other three are hidden in another room, maybe even in another house, in another neighborhood, on another planet, in another reality, in another dimension. Okay.
I can go along with that.
Okay. I just had to be dramatic for a moment.
Absolutely.
But you're, to me, somewhat of a Gnostic thinker. You just follow the truth wherever it takes you. And yet you come from very, very conservative roots. So before we get into the interview itself, let's tell the listeners about your history and what brought you to write your book.
Well, first of all, I like to challenge orthodox thinking, especially the kind of orthodox thinking about the Bible that I was raised with. Not just because I was some kind of rapscallion who needed to question everything and some kind of angst-ridden rebel, but I wanted to know answers to certain questions. And it seemed to me, in my very conservative fundamentalist Baptist teaching and training, those answers weren't forthcoming. As a matter of fact, it almost seemed at times as if questioning deeply was deeply discouraged. And take, for instance.
But you were a Bible teacher, weren't you? Or you were training to be one?
I was in Bible college, and I went to seminary, and I didn't finish either degree. Funny, you wonder how I got into my master's program without having my bachelor's degree. It's too long a story to get into. But I had about 6 years collective training, and I went into youth ministry. So I was working in churches, working with high school youth and junior high school youth. You know, when you're in those things, you're mostly talking about, you know, daily life and how to live daily life and things like this, youth ministry.
Right.
And at the same time, there were questions that I had about the theologies that I was even teaching and passing on. And when we were kids, if you were Judeo-Christian, you learned about, let's take the best example because it ties into the topic, the issue of Noah and the ark. Right. We all heard the story of Noah. We all heard that God was going to destroy the world for its wickedness and wipe out all of mankind except for the one pure man that was left, and that was Noah, his family, and we know the story from there. What we don't get taught ever, it seems, and even with my Bible college training and my seminary training, the touches on this topic were so scant as for me to even remember ever being taught them. That is the preamble to the whole flood story in Genesis chapter 6, which talks about, and the sons of God descended to the earth and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And they were known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old, the men of renown.
Is that the part when Bible class, when you start talking about it, you'd say, and then there was the and moving right along?
Pretty much.
Is that how you guys handle it? Okay, good.
Pretty much. You know, when I think about it too, when you've got a second, third, or fourth grader sitting in a Sunday school class on Sunday morning, and the teacher is teaching the story of Noah and the ark with felt storyboards and little Noah with the beard and the stick and the robes and so on, you've got nobody teaching you about some kind of non-human entity that descended to the earth and had sex with human women, bequeathing the race that actually was the thing that was prompting the flood once you start digging into the passage.
Okay.
So for me, it really goes back to questioning the orthodoxy of the passage. Now, I will say right off the bat that I have no desire to dissuade anybody from what they believe religiously, spiritually, denominationally. That's not my point here. My point is to dig in and find out what the passage says. And you know what happens so many times? We find out that we're taught one thing in church or in synagogue, and when you start digging into the text and seeing what it says a little bit deeper, people don't want to hear it because it challenges what they've been taught. Because sometimes you get a much different picture when you start digging a little bit below the surface.
Well, you know, it's interesting you talk about the deluge because there are hundreds of deluge accounts in folklore all around the world. A case in point is when Captain Cook discovered Hawaii. There's actually on the Big Island, there's a spot that's marked where he first landed, and it's a place called Two Steps. And if you're on the island, it's the greatest place for snorkeling. Trust me.
Love to go there.
Yeah, oh, yeah, definitely.
Especially in this Minnesota winter.
There you go. Yeah, just when you get there, just ask the locals, how do I get to Two Steps?
Oh, right.
But a favorite story of guides and locals is that he, of course, started telling the stories from the Bible. You know, you come pretty quick into Noah and the flood, and he was flabbergasted when the Hawaiians looked at him and said, Well, we already know that story. The only difference between your story and our story is we spelled Noah without the H.
Well, this is part of my research found that there are over 600 different ancient cultures that all have flood stories, most of them with different casts of characters, different creation stories that all lead up to it, but the common threads are what you have to start looking for. If you could for a second, and this is where I say, don't let me step on your toes spiritually, but start thinking about this. If we separate, let's step out of the box for a minute, no matter what you believe.
I love it.
Let's say all Christian, all Judeo, all these other cultures all have these stories of creation and the flood. Let's call them collectively flood mythologies, creation mythologies. Now, this is not to do anything other than give just simplicity of being able to refer to the whole collective of stories in human culture. So you've got this collective of all these stories. They all have different characters, different modes of events, but they all have the big watery deluge. They all have the one family saved or the one person saved and so on. But common to most of these stories, even though the names differ, the events differ, almost all the stories have some sort of non-human or spirit being that intermingles with human women and creates a race of beings bequeathed with human women, and that there is some deity or some superior power of some kind that gets really annoyed by this, and then I'm saying that lightly, and the result is the destruction of everything as a result of this act that was just the wrong thing to have done on this planet. And so what you find when you step out of the pictures, you go, wait, if there's all these different cultures that all have these different stories, 600 plus of them out there, dating back thousands of years, what do you do with that? You say, well, the first thing I can note is it probably was one of two things. It was either some ancient religious council where they all got together from all these different countries.
Well, Scott, we got you back from that, and we have had a tremendous amount of trouble getting this interview. You have a professional studio on your end, and it seems once we get a few minutes into this interview, we get clipped. And this has happened 5 times now. This never happens to me. Does it happen to you?
I have never had this happen during an interview, but I'm going to tell you this. I remember while I was writing this book, I'm digging into things. I dig into not just the old stories, but I dig into demonology a bit with this. I dig into non-human entities versus angels. And something I found, I commented to somebody during the writing of this, I felt so exhausted at one point with thinking through some of these things that I said, it seems to me, I said, I don't want to over-spiritualize things. I'm a fairly pragmatic kind of guy, but I feel like there's some kind of spiritual attack going on. And, if you will, when we talk about these things and say, I believe that this and this and this happened, then something weird happens in life. It's almost like if we don't believe that there is some connectivity, it's almost like we're saying, well, I don't believe anything supernatural could have happened back then either. It's something fantastical. There are huge events that happen to human history, and this is what this book is all about. I'm just approaching it from the theological standpoint, but there is definitely, I feel, resistance.
Well, in all of the times we've had these interruptions, about the point where you get to, I guess I could call it Earth Girls Are Easy. Extraterrestrials mating with women. And by the way, Scotty, I anticipate we're going to continue having some more of this interference as we're going on.
Maybe so.
So for my listeners out there, if this interview gets these jumpy spots, it's because Scotty and I have just said, you know what, illegitimi non corvundum. Don't let the bastards grind you down.
There it is.
So we're going to explore Earth Girls Are Easy and anything else we're going to talk about. And if it takes us 59 gazillion segment interviews that we've got to string together like pearls, I'm more than happy to do it.
Fantastic. Me too.
All right. Arr. Now I'm really curious to find out why somebody doesn't want us to have this conversation.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I can jump way ahead on this just to give what I think might offer a little bit of an explanation. Now, by the way, I think about conspiracies, but I'm not conspiratorial. I am not paranoid in that sense that, oh, somebody's out to get me and stop this broadcast. I don't think I'm that important. But I will tell you this, spiritually speaking, there was a passage in the New Testament where Jesus himself said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be again at the coming of the end times. And what this is all, he actually said at the coming of the Son of Man, but it's the coming of the end times. And this is what I believe is going on, is that there is spiritual interference. There is this whole book, Marshall, is about interference in the human race. whether it be, and it's one coin with two different sides. It is a spiritual interference by spirit beings. It is a physical interference that took place by non-spirit beings but non-human entities. And so either way you look at it, you got to decide, what am I going to believe? And this gets back to your original question of me, is what got me thinking along these lines is that I had all this training in school, Bible school, seminary, I was in ministry, and I had questions that were unanswerable. It seemed within the context and the framework of my denomination, if I asked certain questions, I would get told the same answer with a couple of different aspects of it. It was always the answer, you're a troublemaker. And it was either, it was a very seriously cast charge at me, you're making trouble here, so shut up. Or it was a seminary professor with kind of a wink and a nudge, you know what I mean, kind of, you're a troublemaker, and that wink and a nudge meant, and we both know there is more to this text than our systematic theology tells us.
Well, welcome to the Yeshua School of Open Dialogue. Look what he went through. He was up against the status quo. They didn't like that.
Absolutely.
So anybody that's up against status quo today, I think you're walking closer to Yeshua, at least what he had to go through.
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense.
Well, there are times with this book, I have come out of this saying, I said it rather flippantly and tongue-in-cheek. I said, when I finished the book, I said, wow, I'm going to be criticized and hated by Christians, Jews, scientists, ancient alienists, skeptics, and everything in between alike. And I said that rather tongue-in-cheek because every one of them is going to come up and say, well, why didn't you talk about this? Or how could you present God in that way? Or, hey, you omitted this fact or that fact. There's going to be all kinds of criticism about this because, you know what, my book, I like to call it Nephilim light, because if were I to write the exhaustive concordance on this thing, it would be 10 volumes. So I also like to say, I'm just adding another apple to the apple cart. And somebody out there listening to this might have another apple to add to that cart. This is my take on certain theologies. I'm writing it from within that theological context, and at the same time, I think offering up a few things that are different, even though the story of the Nephilim is not new.
You know, Zechariah Sitchin obviously talks about the Nephilim and the Sumerians at great length, but I really want to stay outside of the Sitchin view of this and really focus more here in terms of the biblical interpretation of what's going on. What I get from your book is that if you are willing to be a heretic, yeah, we're back, and what I'd like for you to do in the this sub-segment of a sub-segment is let's talk about real quickly what you came across in terms of the Council of Nicaea and how that changed the history of the Nephilim, the current prohibition against extra-biblical works that you discussed earlier, and also a bias against what people call the Jewish stuff.
Okay. Well, I found in the study of this whole topic that there were, it seems to me, when you start reading the Genesis passage about the Nephilim, one of two things. The author of Genesis, who I establish in the book as being Moses, I don't think there's much reason to question that, even though the book of Genesis obviously has many hands in it, in its authorship, especially the parts where Moses is writing about historical data. You have, in these texts, I believe, a choppy version of Hebrew. You've got, if this indeed was written by one hand, you start reading the book of Genesis, and when you get to the account of the Nephilim in chapter 6, the account of the Nephilim is in a totally different hand. It's in a totally different, choppy, almost edited-looking version. It would almost be like, again, one of two things. Somebody else came in and wrote it later, or Moses or the author himself was just paraphrasing a different source, which we do find, by the way, when we go to the book of Enoch, which is not canonical scripture. It was booted out of the Bible in the Council of Nicaea and other councils of Constantine in the 300s. What you've got is accounts that look choppy, that hail to other books like Enoch, and Enoch gives the same verbiage in its text, except it expands it into chapters as opposed to just a handful of verses like Genesis. So what I found in my research is this. You got to go up to Constantine, 325 AD, while he's the emperor of Rome, and by history recorded as, I think he even called himself as the first Christian emperor of Rome, when in fact he was nothing of the sort. He was as pagan, if you will, not using that as a derogatory term, but he was as pagan as the rest of the Roman Caesars, but he found in Christianity a unifying element. And what Constantine was out to do was this. He, first of all, hated the division that the church had, even though, because it was so popular with the people at that time, he thought we were going to use this politically to establish a couple of different things. Number one God equals one emperor. Number two, one religion equals one empire. And he couldn't establish that, however, with all the schisms going on in the church and all the division. So basically, you've got the emperor of Rome convoking these councils and, in a sense, looking at them. You can almost see the subtext here in history of Constantine almost leaning forward and saying, and we will find unanimity, won't we? This is the emperor.
Hey, listen, you're talking about a guy that had his son killed and one of his wives boiled alive in oil.
Yeah.
When a psychopath tells you this is where the cow chews the cud, you just say, yes, sir.
And when that psychopath has the power to do something about it, if you don't, just say, yes, sir. As a matter of fact, his church historian, Eusebius, is the guy who recorded all these events and started, in a sense, laying forward church policy. That is still, the writings of Eusebius are still used by the church today. So it hasn't varied much. But here you've got a guy who, after the Council of Nicaea, this big spiritual event where you have all these bishops and different religious figures gathered together in the church to decide unanimity on certain topics and to establish the church is this unanimous governing factor in the Roman Empire, he goes home and murders, as you said, his wife and his son.
Yeah.
And in very heinous ways because he felt that they were conspiring against him. Is this what a Christian emperor does?
Well, I think there's a big difference between your belief in God and your belief in an institution. And so when the two get confused, it all lumps together. You weren't so confused. You were pursuing this knowledge. Now, there's the warnings. It's like what they told Columbus. You sail out far enough, you'll fall off the edge of the world.
Right.
Okay, so you sailed out to the edge of the world. Did you fall off?
Yes and no.
I think that's interesting. Tell me more.
Well, it's kind of like this, you know, in the faith that I was raised, the denomination that I was schooled in, you didn't question things. And if you questioned, it was all within the syllabus or all within the structure. As a good example, I went to my best friend all through high school and college days, Bible school. His dad was the dean of the seminary that was attached to our big church when I was in the youth group as a kid. And he became the dean of a seminary out in Detroit. And I went to visit my buddy out in Detroit at his church. And we're sitting in the adult Sunday school class now. There's about 100 adults in there, our age group at the time, 35 to 40. And he's teaching on the book of Genesis. And I had a question. And I came from a church where we sat around tables and we threw everything out. We bantered, we laughed, we talked, and we divided the word of truth, as the Bible says. We wanted to learn something, so we questioned things. Well, he's teaching, and I had a question, a sincere question about what he was teaching, and I put my hand up. As my hand started to go up, my buddy caught it out of the corner of his eye, grabbed my arm, and pulled it down. I looked at him, and I said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "We don't ask questions here." And I said, well, how the hell do you learn? And he was more appalled that I used the word hell as a cuss word than the fact that I was appalled that I couldn't ask a question. And so I remained quiet, and I didn't walk out or storm out. I was going to make a scene. But that is the cusp, if you will, or the crux of the denomination I was in. You didn't question things. And to question things meant, are you questioning the Word of God? So everything we were taught, the rule of practice we were told was, the Bible is my one foundation for faith and practice, and I do not sway from it, and I do not use extra biblical materials. If it's not in the Bible, it doesn't exist. And that's the way we were governed and the way we thought. And when I started questioning those things, that's when the problems arose. One of the first big questions I had was not even on this passage of the Nephilim. It was on the name of God. If you look at the Old Testament, there are several names throughout the Old Testament used for God. One of the ones used the most times, almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament, is the word Elohim. And the name for God was El, and the him was the suffix at the end of the word denoting singularity or plurality. Just like the word Nephilim, the word Nephal in the Hebrew means to come down, to descend, to leave one's estate for another, to change place. Im just is the suffix that denotes plurality. So those who came down, those who fell, so on. With Elohim, El is the name of God. Him is that plural suffix which stands for plurality. And it's literally translated, the word means God of many gods, or God among many gods. And when I first learned this, I thought, what does that mean? And I started digging into it, and of course we were taught, and said, well, this means it's the God with multiplicity of powers and majesty. It's like a monarch. You hear monarchs all the time that would say, well, we will bestow this act upon our people, speaking of themselves, plural. Well, the only problem is that the word Elohim is used both plurally and singularly in the Old Testament, depending on the context of the passage.
Right.
So you have to start digging into the etymology of the words. It's like our English word deer. You can say, I see a deer standing in the front yard. I see a herd of deer standing in the backyard. And so you found that Elohim stood for God speaking of himself, people speaking of God in a singular. You also found it where God himself uses the word to speak of a plurality. It was even used as a word to describe the man who was selling false idols made out of wood, clay, and bronze out of his tent, the Elohim collected in his tent. And this leads me, this was one of my first big questions, is God a plurality or is God a singularity? Well, if it's plural, it's referring to the Trinity. And I hate to disappoint you Trinitarians, it doesn't say that in any of the passages in context. It never says that this plurality of God means three essences of God. As a matter of fact, you find God in Psalm 82 and in a couple of other places referring to, it says, and God or Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim. And he said, you are all Elohim, you are the bright shining princes of heaven. It's a plurality he's speaking to, the divine council in that context, which comes into a description of the Nephilim later on as we get there. So I started questioning things by some very simple things. What does this word mean? Why does God speak of himself in the plural? Why is it even in the English in the book of Genesis, like the fall of Adam and Eve? It says, and God was speaking and he said, they have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's us not let them eat of the tree of life, lest they become like us, like gods. So that was one of my first big questions.
All right, hold that thought. Let's come back for the second segment, and let's really then dive into the big question. Who really are the Nephilim according to the Bible and the extra-biblical works you've been using in your research? Me hearties, we're having a Nephilim time tonight. I think he's a hoot. I really am enjoying this interview. And we have got a caller from Oregon. Patrice, you're on the air.
Hi, Marshall.
Hi. And you'd called in, you had a comment? Fire away.
Yes. Your guest is totally right on, and I just wanted to comment that I've had almost exactly the same experience as he has, only I never went to Bible college or seminary, but I was born and raised in the Catholic Church, and then as a young adult I converted to Baptist and became quite involved in the church to the point that we worked Billy Graham crusades, we sang in the choir, we had Sunday school class, we had the youth group, and as I got deeper and deeper into studying the Bible and I would ask questions in Sunday school class, finally I was taken aside by the head of the deacons and the pastor and told that I was becoming a troublemaker, and if I did not desist with my questions that I would be removed from the membership and no longer welcome at the church.
Well,
at that
Patrice,
point, I left.
How did you feel when they said that to you and you left? But I mean,
it made me angry. It made me angry because I felt like I felt disillusioned because I felt like they had the answers, and that I was within my rights to be asking the same questions that your guest has just been talking about, where it says, let us confuse their language and let us make man in our image. You know, all those same questions were the questions I had. But, you know, they did me a great favor because I went on after that and became a student of not only the Bible, but I have studied the history of religions. I've read all Ditchkin's books. You know, I've just done a very intensive study, and it has been a long path, but I have learned so much, and I am so grateful, and I think it's wonderful that you're having this man on because he knows what he's talking about, and everybody in the audience should really listen carefully to what he has to say because I have spent many years, this is clear back like in 1966 that I left the church, and I have studied intensively ever since then, and this man knows what he's talking about. He's right on so far.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Let me ask you a question. In terms of how you feel your relationship to a divine creator, Yahweh, I mean, since you have been on your own and you're sorting this out on your own, has it changed one way or the other?
Well, it's changed tremendously, and I do have to say that I did go through a period of time a couple of years ago where I would say, pretty much lost my faith, mainly because I had been indoctrinated into Jesus Christ as personal Savior, And then as my studies went on, and I certainly don't want to offend anybody in the office because everybody has their own path to walk, and my path is not necessarily theirs. I can only speak from my own experience.
I can tell you my audience is very well offended in general about everything because I am already a born-again heretic. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I found that I could no longer accept a lot of what I'd been taught as a quote, Christian, and so I did lose my faith for a while. I even pretty much quit praying, and then finally I just came to the point that I realized that even though I had to discard a lot of the illusions and thinking that I had been indoctrinated with, not only in parochial school as a child, but in the church as an adult, and I had to move forward, and I did realize that when I looked back on my life, I could see there is definitely a divine creator. He has always taken care of me and miraculously helped me over and over again. And once I got over thinking of God in human terms, you know, like we like to think of God, well, you know, God has a body and he gets mad and he's happy and he punishes and, you know, he rewards. And once you get past all these human terms, the way we like to interpret God in human terms, once we get past that and realize that, frankly, God is way beyond and more wonderful and awesome than anything we could think of him in human terms, it really restores your faith. And I've become quite excited about, and it sounds corny because just things like, you always know that, you know, God is in everything because he created everything. But when you really think about how the God essence is in everything, you're constantly surrounded by God. And once you really internalize that concept, you're never alone again. It's like I never fear death anymore, never fear death. I mean, I'm here and I have a mission to assist people, you know, with the coming things that are going to happen. But if something happens and I somehow don't survive, I'm not the least bit worried about it because I know that life goes on. You know, I exist outside of this shell that I'm occupying right now. And so, if anything, my faith has been greatly expanded. It's just that I had to undo a lot of brainwashing to get here, but it was worth it, and it's been a wonderful, exciting path.
Okay, and if you will go to my website, yowza.com, go into the Humanities section, you can just search on the article about the meek and why they inherit the earth. I have an article there. I think it'll be a real treat for you. Patrice, I have really enjoyed your call. We've got 2 more in the queue, and we've got a lot of show coming up. Thank you so much.
Well, that's great, Marshall. I appreciate being on. I just want to let you know that I not only have followed you for since 2009, but I'm a member of your Planet X Town Hall, and I follow you religiously, and you have just done wonders for me. I really appreciate your devotion to mankind and everything you've done to try to inform us of what's happening.
Thank you for making my night, Patrice.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too. And see you on the board. I'll see you on the board.
All righty.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. And we're going to go foot free here, and we've got a caller coming in from 631, and for you caller in the 561, you're next up in the queue. Hello there, caller in the 631. Could I have your name, please?
How are you doing? My name is Sidney.
Hey, Sidney.
Yes, I've been a scientific researcher for over a decade, and I've read about 7 different holy books, you know, from the Torah, a couple of versions of the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Popol Vuh, and definitely it does point to aliens, and not just 1 or 2, but factions of warring aliens that surprisingly enough to some do sacrifice and eat people. And what I noticed that a lot of UFO researchers, or what they call them today, ancient alien theorists, you know, it's just another label, but what they miss is that they're still here, that this is what we see when we see Western civilization, that Columbus didn't sail across the ocean without those maps. And I noticed a lot of researchers do not touch on this because everybody in power today still sacrifices children, drinks human blood, and pays homage to their alien masters at the expense of practically more than 90% of the planet. All the governments are evil and crooked. And I noticed that David Icke and a couple other researchers that I've spoken with personally he's probably the only one that really came up with a realistic theory of the fact that they can control a certain type of people easier than others. So those were the ones that they sent over about 5 centuries ago, and now we see the entire rape of the planet from those same 5 to 7 different countries that come from Western Asia, which, you know, has been retermed Europe. And, you know, it's just, I tell people in my teachings, the only thing that separates Europe from Asia is a lie. It's the same continent. So they must make sure that we stay divided. And this is why everything today is basically based on racism. Some people will say, oh, well, you know, you're harping on that too much. But I said, well, if we look at it with an open mind, look at the evidence, we can see that humanity is divided. There's an invisible caste system put upon the planet. And no researchers I've seen, alien researchers, talk about this. Mormons, you know, look at what the Mormons say, you know, honestly. You know, you didn't fight with God, you were cursed with brown skin. So I said, okay, let me look at this scientifically. If a being was to curse someone,
Sydney, our show's tight tonight, so you're going to have to get to it real quick here, because I got a lot of show to do tonight, and I have only 2 hours to do it. So give me that point. Okay, the point is, in the Book of Mormon and in the Talmud and other books, the mark of Cain, which Westerners try to affiliate with dark skin, doesn't make sense. It would make more sense to make the person burn in the sun as a punishment, because dark skin actually isn't a punishment. We don't see people with brown skin getting burned. So it is kind of reversed, and we need to realize that everybody in these religious factions, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, they are all with the agenda of the aliens of giving children to them, giving women to them. Aha, you and I are on the same frequency here, because that's really getting to it. And Sydney, I'd love to go on longer, but we've got a ton of show to do, and just hang with me and enjoy the show. I've got one more caller in the queue, and we got to get to the second segment. But you nailed it right on the spot. Thanks.
All right.
Caller in the 561, could I have your name, please? I think that sounds like Robert Ryland.
How did you guess?
Hey, I don't know. You got a shtick. You got a shtick. So how you enjoying it?
This all sounds like me.
Yeah. Oh,
that's what you told me would happen.
Yeah.
In so many words. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you out there that this is, by the way, let me just introduce you. This is Robert Ryland. He's the author of Jesus in the Third Temple, and so that you know, we're going to be going into a large series on this, 13 interviews, and we're going to be getting into a history of the Middle East that is going to blow your mind. It's the stuff that you're not allowed to get, and I'll be talking about that more. And so, Bob, real quick, because I've got to get into my second segment.
Yeah.
Comment on this.
Like Scott and I wear the same kind of shoes. We've been in the sights of the traditionalists among the evangelicals. I mean, they don't want to hear anything they haven't heard before, for the amounts to. And he's been there just like I have. So I'm enjoying this.
All right. Well, you know, there's a lot of faiths that have it. Zachariah Sitchin, you guys could sit and drink a cup of coffee together and have a lot of yucks, although he's not with us, but still the same, though. He hit the same wall. And then you did, that got you to go above. All right, Bob, stick with me, and I'm just going to do a quick segue here back into segment 2, because we've got some long segments. This show is recorded. It went long. So hang with me, Bob.
Okay.
One real quick comment before we get into the second segment, folks, about diversity. My favorite species on the planet is the redwood tree. I live amongst redwoods, and I love them because they have an interlocking root system, and I know that my house is just going to bounce up and down in the earthquakes instead of going from side to side, which means I'm less likely to be wearing my ceiling when the shaking stops. And here's an interesting thing. We all know how many chromosomes humans have. Do you know a redwood has 66 chromosomes? And it's from 11 different parents. And it's that kind of diversity that has given that species endurance over time. How much time? I want you to think about this. When the Chicxulub impact, 65 million years ago, took out the dinosaurs, probably after they already had one foot in the grave, at that point, it was the dominant species of the northern hemisphere. Completely covered the northern hemisphere because it's a subtropical species. It's why now it's next to coastlines, because it needs that extra fog coming in from the ocean. But the species, if you go back to its earliest roots, was already somewhere around 140 million years old when that impact happened. They're still here today. And so if diversity is a sign of endurance as a species, folks, we really all want to be like redwoods. Now, I'm moving on into Seg 2, so hang with me because it's just going to get better. I often say to folks when they tell me about how they're now seeing all of these things, tell me, was coming into awareness for you like being slapped in the face with a dead salmon and there you were, spitting scales and wondering how you got there? And to a person, they always say the same thing. Yeah, that really describes it. Now, folks, that is awareness. And there's no comfortable way to deal with it. But there are ways that you can help people ease into it with less stress, considerably less fear, and more importantly, with hope. That was one of the reasons why I produced my video, The 5 Stages of Catastrophism. And that is really based on what I had written about in my book, Indigo ET Connection, many years ago. And with ET Connection, what I'm talking about is the role indigo children will play in contact with extraterrestrial races during the coming tribulation, because this is a consistent drumbeat theme. We're going to be making contact. I also dive into this in my book, God's Child Covenant, Return of Nibiru. Now, both of these offer an interesting way for teens in particular to come to this and to see where they fit in the grand scheme of things. With God's Child Covenant, what you have is fiction based on fact. And it takes the kids through what will probably be a real-life situation. It's based in a triage camp in Los Gatos, California. And that's where people go to live or go to die, being resigned to either fate. And the lessons there are very clear. For example, the sexes need to face this equally. If we lose all the social advances that we've seen in the last half-century, now what happens? Well, all you have to do is see what the plight of women and children is in places like Afghanistan, where they're chattels. They're really not human beings, and the women are trapped in arranged marriages that are so horrific they set themselves on fire to escape them. The result is you have tribal societies that cannot generate their own technology. They're clever, and they can use the technology they steal, beg, or borrow, but they don't have the ability to do it on their own. And that's because when a man subjugates a woman or a child, he must first subjugate himself to a greater evil. And this is the lesson these old tribal cultures have yet to learn. But it is core to the message of both God's Child Covenant, Return of Nibiru, and Indigo ET Connection. So consider these books for your teens, and perhaps even a spouse who likes adventure novels and something light reading that's tangential, but not direct, as a way to gently immerse them into their own awareness. And with that, let's move on to the interview. Well, Scotty, we're just going to keep going as far as we can and get her interrupted, and we'll come right back like a couple of bronc riders.
There you go.
We just don't know when to stay down.
All we're doing is we're going to start talking and see if we can hang on for 8 seconds.
That's it. There you go. So instead of us talking about the 3 corners that are missing, which we did a good job of in the first segment, let's put all 4 corners on the table.
All right.
And then you work it in from there. How's that?
Okay, that sounds good.
Rock and roll.
All right. Well, let me say this. As we talked about at the beginning, my take on the Nephilim in this book was to study the topic within its theology, its theological framework. And then I used some outside sources to establish some of my case. But mostly I'm trying to establish in this book a thread of logic that falls behind and beneath, and this is the subtext to the scriptures that are there. I have found, as I mentioned with all the questions I had, I found that there is a subtext that exists to all the stories we find in the Old Testament that revolve around these characters. And when there is a subtext, a story, an encoded message starts to come out, you say, wait a minute, why was that encoded? And then why did Constantine kick some of the books that talked about it out of the Bible? These are the things that started governing my putting together the framework for the Nephilim. Now, I mentioned the book of Genesis, chapter 6, it talks about the story of Noah's flood. But it begins with the account of the Nephilim. And it talks about how in those days the sons of God, or as it's known in the Hebrew, the Bene Ha-Elohim, and we talked about Elohim in the last segment, the sons of God descended to the earth and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And they were known as the
Earth girls are easy.
Earth girls are easy. Now, for many years, these beings were thought to be, and I'm going to set up the framework here. These beings were thought to be fallen angels because of the word Nephilim, which meant to fall. But what they're forgetting is that Nephilim means that's the descendants. That's not the Bene Ha-Elohim. That's the descendants of the Bene Ha-Elohim, and human women are known as the Nephilim. The fallen, the ones who came down, the ones who left their estate. And in a way, I kind of liken it to an Irish immigrant coming to America. You can say the Irish immigrant who comes to America, his children are known as Irish Americans, and eventually the original immigrants become to be known as Irish Americans as well. So I think it's a title that got stretched across both the parents and the offspring, but the offspring was where it began. Now, the Bene Ha-Elohim, who came down to earth and impregnated human women, you go over to you don't find a lot about them, by the way, in the book of Genesis. It's almost like a mention. It's like, whoa, Moses, or writer of Genesis, whatever you want to call him, why did you just throw that wild thing out at me here, but don't give me anything to go on?
Got a question.
Yes.
Do you think it was a sloppy retraction or a redaction?
I think it was neither. I think it was I can't write about Noah's flood without mentioning these characters. And therefore, I'm just going to mention it later. You look at how Moses handled writing. The whole situation in Egypt, he never mentions who was who. He doesn't mention the dating system of the day. He doesn't mention anything. He said Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter, this guy, that guy, so on and so forth.
It's interesting. I have a point on that because we publish a book, the Colburn Bible, and it has the Egyptian accounts of Exodus. And what is consistent is not only did the Hebrews not name names in terms of the royal family, neither did the Egyptians. I think it was one of those tacit understandings.
We all know.
We're not going to talk about it.
We all know this happened. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Let's move on.
Right.
Yeah. So I think what you have in the story of the Nephilim is Moses making mention. But you know what that also establishes?
What?
And I don't want to rabbit trail too much here, but in my book I take a whole chapter and devote it to Moses, the dating of Moses, who he would have been in the Pharaoh's court, who were the people around him, and so on. I titled that chapter, The Pharaoh God of Israel. And the reason I think this is Moses, at the time that he fled Egypt, he was 40 years old. You tell me any 40-year-old, even in our culture, where age was a factor, where age is not as much of a factor, somebody for 40 years being established in one thing and then changing their minds is a pretty big thing. Moses didn't have any kind of conversion. Moses fled Egypt because he murdered somebody, and it said the Pharaoh was out to get him after that. And the big question is, why did Pharaoh care what Moses did if he was a nobody in Egypt? He wasn't a nobody. He was a somebody. And so what happened there, you've got Moses, when the Bible says he identified himself with his people, I think the book of Hebrews in the New Testament extrapolates faith and applies it to Moses. I don't think Moses did any of those acts by faith. I think they are called acts of faith afterwards. Moses was an Egyptian pure and through. And when he wrote the book of Genesis, after he had become the leader of Israel 40 years later, he is bringing with him all the military training, all the royal court training, all the education that he grew up with, all the theology he grew up with. And I find Moses is establishing himself, I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that Moses was being groomed to be the next Pharaoh because of the people who are around him in the historical record. And you got to fill in some gaps. I realize there's some speculation involved, but I believe I know exactly who he was and when he was. And if this is the person he was as he was living in Egypt, he would have grown up with the stories of the Ogdode, the creation myths of the Egyptians. And you see the Ogdode philosophies, if you will, theologies, sewn and intricately patterned in and throughout Hebrew tradition as Moses established it. Just as Paul established first century Christianity, Moses established Old Testament Hebrew or Jewish religion. So you've got Moses now who wrote about this stuff, and he wrote about it for a certain reason, and he omitted things for a certain reason. And I want to just say one thing about Moses, then I'll move on, because we're not talking about Moses per se in this whole interview. But there's an interesting thing he writes about. When they're wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites, and they set up camp while they're during that 40 years, it says that God's Shekinah, or the presence of God, would descend on Moses' tent, and he would talk to, and remember, Moses is writing this, and Moses would talk to God face to face as a man talked to his friend. Now you go 9 verses later in the same exact chapter, and Moses is laying down the law from God, and no man can see God's face and live. What was Moses establishing there? Was he establishing, I'm more than a man? What was the sin that he committed that, according to whoever picked up the pen after he passed away and finished his book, what was the sin he committed that God didn't allow him to go into the promised land? He equated himself with God. So what was Moses falling back on? His education in the royal courts of Egypt, being groomed as a pharaoh. And what was the pharaoh? The pharaoh was the pharaoh god of Egypt. And Moses, I think, was establishing himself as the pharaoh god of Israel. And this all ties into why he wrote the things the way he did, and why he talked about the Nephilim and their intermingling with the children of men the way that he did. And even in his passage, there's something very interesting here. When we learned about the Noah and the Ark story, we always learned that Noah was the man who was chosen. Why? Because he was the only righteous man left in his family. And so God chose him. But what it says in the Hebrew is not righteous. It says Noah was the only pure-blooded family left. And it makes great emphasis on stating, it even states it this way in the English, and we always washed right over this. It says Noah was a man who was chosen because he was pure in all his generations. And all we attributed that to, that's just an emphasis on how righteous the man was before God's eyes. No, wrong. Thank you for playing. In the Hebrew, it states emphatically that Moses, or I keep interchanging Moses with Noah, that Noah was chosen because he was righteous before God, but because he was pure-blooded and his generations were pure from creation to where he stood at that point. Meaning, why is that important? Because there was something about the Nephilim, the sons of God, coming down, impregnating human women, creating a race of hybrids known as the Nephilim. There was something about that Noah needed to come across to the reader of the text and the listener to the story as being pure-blooded, that he was not part of that race. And something I found in my study of all of this, and this is where I get back into the theological point of view, is that if you look in the book of Genesis earlier on, the whole Garden of Eden scenario, the serpent, get into that in a minute and establish why I say this, is that there was a need to establish the kinsman redeemer, the Messiah, who was first prophesied at the scene in Eden with the fall of man. And the first messianic prophecy is given, and then God says, and there will be enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, or the seed of mankind is what that meant. And that is because a dual seed in humanity was progenited right from the very beginning. Is that the serpent in the garden, it wasn't just a simple temptation, eat of this fruit, and God cursed everybody because there was just simple disobedience that took place. The whole scenario in Eden is sexual in its context. You start looking at the language. The serpent character, he's never called Lucifer or Satan in the text. That's attributed much later in the Bible. The text, if that was important, it never calls him that in the text. Again, Moses wrote this. The name isn't there. But the word for serpent was Nakosh, which meant trickster, bringer of knowledge, illuminator, bright shining one. This is the one who I believe all the verbs that you find, which are neutral verbs in the Hebrew, but the offering of the fruit, the taking of the fruit, the eating, the giving to Adam, it's subtexted, hidden and coded language for the sexual sin that Eve was impregnated by the serpent and also impregnated by Adam. She bore twins, which is very relevant when you look at all the other creation mythologies that are out there that speak of multiple births in the first family. And she bore these twins, Cain and Abel. One of them was of the seed of the serpent, Nakosh, and the other was of the seed of Adam. And it was very important that if the Messiah, who under the Jewish, or at least at that time, Hebrew understanding of the word, and still today, Messiah meant kinsman redeemer, a redeemer that would come from one of us. He could not be bequeathed from the line of Cain because Cain was of the impure mixed blood of Nakosh and the woman. He had to come from the line of Abel. And when you find Noah being traced back to Adam, you find King David, his lineage through the Bible, all those boring genealogies being traced back to Adam. You find Mary, the mother of Jesus. They had to establish that Jesus was of the throne of David So they trace her lineage back to King David and then back to Adam. Do they take it back to Adam through the eldest born, the Hebrew tradition, which was trace the genealogy through the oldest born, Cain? No, they took it through the lesser born, the second born, Abel. Why? Because there was no pure bloodline with the eldest. The pure bloodline was through the younger. And so Noah had to, in this story, be pure in all his generations because it was to be his offspring that would bequeath eventually again the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer.
Okay.
Now, I jumped all over the place.
Yeah, you did, but I mean, I'm seeing a pattern here that really comes in this intermingling of species. You know, you stop and think about it, you know, it takes you back to Nazi Germany, and
Sure does.
they had all of these charts and measurement tools and how to define who is a pure Aryan and who is not. I mean, the whole emphasis on maintaining some sort of racial purity factors very heavily. And so what you're really doing here is you're making a case for that this is, if we take a lot of the allegorical judgments and pronouncements out of it,
Right.
what we really see at the essence is that there were some people who came here, mated with earth women, created bastards in terms of their purity, and so the way to deal with that was through cataclysm.
Right. And I think you could boil it down to two words: race interrupted. There is some interruption. If you look and stay within the theology of the Old Testament, you can see where they're taking that. You step outside the box of that theology where I say, push it all aside a second and call it all the collective mythologies. You also find that all these races had the same stories. When they talked about the flood, they all had the preamble of spirit beings or non-human entities intermingling with human women and a deity being pissed off because of that. And then you also have in the creation mythologies some kind of trickster character, some kind of illuminator that came in and impregnated either the woman of the creation pair or one of the daughters of them. And and by the way, something I forgot to correlate this. This is why I brought these two items up. Nakash in the Old Testament, in the Garden of Eden scenario, the serpent character, Nakash defines as trickster, bringer of knowledge, bright shining one, bringer of illumination. You go back up to Psalm 82 that I mentioned earlier, where it's got God talking to the divine council in heaven. These are not angels. These are not fallen angels. This is where Elohim proclaims them Elohim, gods, and he says, you are the bright, shining princes of heaven. And he's casting judgment on them in Psalm 82 for some reason. The reason that is there, look at the bright, shining ones of the divine council, these gods of heaven, and look at Nakash, the bright, shining one who intercepted or interfered with the human race in Genesis. And then you look at the Watchers, as the Book of Enoch calls them, or the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim. They correlate with other mythologies of figures that came down to earth from the heavens or the stars or the skies and impregnated human women. They were known as, like, again, 600 different cultures, but you had some examples. You had the Tuatha De Danann of the Celtic legends and lore. They were the bright, shining kings from heaven, the tall folk who came down and intermingled with the daughters of humans, and their offspring were known as the elven folk. So Tolkien, by the way, was onto something. And I think he knew a lot about what went on in these passages. He dug into this stuff very deeply.
Yeah, I think he tapped into source as well. Now, I remember the story about when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he didn't write it as a trilogy. He wrote it originally as one single text.
Right.
And the publisher looked at the manuscript and said, are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
And so the publisher broke it up into 3 books for a trilogy. But in his mind, it was all one massive story. And
always
something like that really comes from tapping into source.
Yes.
Finding access to information that's not normally there. Now I'm talking as an author, and I write both fiction and nonfiction. But to have something like that, you have to have a vision of a story that big. And
right,
that's a tough thing. You really got to be good. You got to either do a lot of research or you got to be tapped into it. So when we come back in the next segment, what I'd like to do is finish up what we're talking about here, but I want to get into how this research has changed your worldview.
Okay.
How you feel your relationship with God has changed as a result of this, whether it's diminished or enhanced or is basically the same. And then, moving forward, what is the significance of this given our current situation? At the last break, I really enjoyed the calls, Patrice in Oregon, and Bob and Sydney. And for me, this is all a journey for truth and for answers. And frankly, folks, who am I to say whether my answers are better than your answers? No doubt they're going to be different in some respects, and in others they're going to be a lot alike. But I'll tell you what I'm about is I want you to know you're not alone. There's others out there who see things the way you do, and you're feeling the same frustration. And so, to Patrice and all of my folks out there on Planet X Town Hall, I want to share my most favorite music, and I want you to think about the lyrics of this song. Think about these lyrics, because when we come back for part 3, it's going to really be powerful. Strength. But what also gives me more strength are you folks out there that you're going it, you're doing it, you're marching to the beat of a different drummer. You got the guts to stand alone in your knowing if that's what it takes. And you're good people, you're kind, and you're compassionate. And I love you. I really, really do. And with that, we are going into segment 3. And this one is a long segment. That's why I've been pushing the show a little bit tonight. But it's going to knock the ball out of the park. A little bit about organized suppression by means of disinformation and propaganda, of knowledge that every man, woman, and child on the planet should have full and unfettered access to. Now, I'm talking about what is happening to our Earth, what is happening to us, and our future in terms of making contact with other races. A term I often hear used to disparage people in the mainstream who simply are not going to pay attention to any of the things that are important to you and to me is that, well, they're sheeple, they're stupid. I don't see them that way. I see them as the largest collection of victims in the history of humankind. And they're not going to fare well, because all you have to do is look at films like 2012. If you watch 2012 the first time, yes, there's the visual Hollywood-esque eye candy with buildings falling and Los Angeles sinking into the sea. But if you watch the film a couple of more times after that, what you find is the director, Emmerich, really tells you exactly how things are. And I found that to be really, really cogent. Because what the elites understand is that there's not enough resources to save some 7 billion people. Maybe a small fraction of that, but not much more. And so when you look at the movie 2012, what do you see? In events leading up to it, there is an outright suppression of the knowledge. Then you have the media in denial about the early harbinger events. And consequently, what happens is that when the event happens, it happens suddenly. And nobody knows what's happening until the day they die. And many of them don't even have that convenience. They just die. And who lives? The 1% who have decided that the other 99% are just expendable eaters. And so it's kind for them to die this way. Now, if that is not you, if you're trying to understand the mechanisms by which they suppress this knowledge, I would recommend to you our book, Alien Security, an Anthology for Human Freedom. It really does present to you a good overview of fiction based on fact, of the cover-ups and the mistakes of our government in dealing with contacts with other races. But at the back of the book is what we call the battle book. And I put a lot of effort into this. And it will show you how subtle, how powerful, and how pervasive the disinformation and propaganda of the elites to keep us into the darks really is. But you're not helpless. You can do something about it. And that's the whole point of Alien Security. So if you really want to understand the mechanisms of forced ignorance, get this book, read it, and particularly read the battle book at the back. And with that, let's move on to our interview. Well, back for the third segment. And Scotty, coming out of the second segment, these guys come out of space, they look at Earth girls, and they go, wow, they are so boppable.
How you doing? How you doing?
Hey, baby, what sign are you born under? Keep off the grass.
Yeah. And by the way, they would answer, what's a sign? And that was one of the things that the Watchers did. They taught the forbidden knowledges.
Yeah, there it is. So you've tapped into this, all right, and your book goes into really good depth for the readers. Out of curiosity, because, you came from a very conservative background where what you're talking about in this conversation was just purely unthinkable.
Right.
That's it. You just don't go there. And yet, one of the reasons why you're not supposed to go there is that you get lost and dark forces are going to snag you up or whatever it is.
Right.
Or you just simply, that's it, you're off everybody's Christmas card list.
As Justin Martyr called this stuff in the first century, he called it diabolical mimicry. It's all the works of Satan trying to make things look really good or like the things of God. Mm-hmm. And that was the way they explained away everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty absolutist. But let's just talk about you in your relationship with Creator, however you want to call it, Yeshua, God, Yahweh, whatever it is. I mean, how has it changed you as a Christian? How do you view yourself now?
I have not thrown out the baby with the bathwater. I'm rather fond of saying that. It seems like I've said it thousands of times now over the last year. But
sorry, but hey, man, it just comes. I guess we're just having this real continuing problem with dialogue interrupt us here.
Yeah, I've never seen this so much. The only time that my internet seemed to go down so many times was when I was talking with Dr. John Ward out in Luxor, Egypt, about symbology or symbolism, mm-hmm. ancient symbolism leading up to the Cathars and so on. And we had 9 times in an hour conversation, the connection dropped. And it was very interesting. I don't know what you want to put to this, but my wife went upstairs as I was finishing that conversation. And as I said goodbye and I hung up, she noticed there was a white van, unmarked panel van sitting across the street. And as soon as I hung up, that van took off. Now, what does that mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just a diaper delivery service, and he was taking a break. But we thought that was very interesting. And again, the big question comes up, who the hell am I that somebody would want to intercept or tamper with my connection? But I think you're dealing with topics here, and have been on your show, that some people don't want people to hear.
Hey, listen, this happens a lot, and there's some topics, zero interference, nobody bothers me. But on something here where it starts diving into doctrine, so there's some of this old knowledge that folks just don't want out there.
Right.
But we're here, we've got this connection, and I want the answer to this question. How are you with God?
My view of God is that God has changed for me. He is not the God that I grew up with. He is a God that is bigger and broader, perhaps more majestic, perhaps more dark than I had ever seen God before. Mm-hmm. You know, we were brought up in this evangelical style of Christianity where, oh, God is love, and God is there with his arms open wide to take you and take all your problems. And I do not wish again to poo-poo that notion. But I am finding that the God that I found in the Old Testament and all these writings about the Nephilim and these interworkings of the bloodlines and so on is a God that, if I may say it this way and pardon my crassness, he's a God that gives 2 squats about humanity. He made them. We are his to do with as he pleases. And as a matter of fact, we were even taught in our theology, in the Baptist theology, that we are nothing. We are zero. Our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, leprous rags before the eyes of God, as Scripture says. This is what we were taught. And I think, though, that God is bigger. He doesn't care much about humanity. But if you were to go to the theology of it, there's something to the kinsman redeemer. And God, if you will, my view of him is that he filters all of his activities with mankind through the kinsman redeemer. And that goes, again, to your orthodoxy of certain Scripture. Do you believe the Messiah has come? Do you believe he has not come? And I believe within the framework of Christian theology that God only views us through the kinsman redeemer. And this is why there was such importance put on it in the Old Testament, why there was such importance of staying faithful to God. Mm-hmm. So God to me is somebody that is much more distant than he used to be. Mm-hmm. As the God of the universe. I think there might even be different manifestations of God. I also believe that what we were taught in Judeo-Christianity, that the Bible is monotheistic, I think is not so anymore. When God calls other beings gods, they might be minor gods, but he's still calling them gods. He's still calling himself the God of gods. He's still referring to himself in the plural. The Bible does not teach monotheism. There is more going on outside the realm or the dimension or the thread of this reality, I think, than we can put our fingers on or understand with our biblical theologies or any of our theologies in this world.
So in other words, what you came from was a very terrestrial view
Yes.
of all that there is. And now you have embarked upon a more cosmic view of everything. But is this more cosmic view more or less comforting in comparison to the terrestrial view of the doctrinal and dogma approach?
The late Richard Feynman once said, he said that all these stories about God, if they are true, to think that God, out of all the known universe and unknown universe, would come to this place, he says, to me seems to be so colloquial and so local. And that's kind of the way I think about it. He went on in that phrase to say, I feel perfectly comfortable feeling lost in the cosmos. Now, he was an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I would say that I view the same thing. And I say for God or a manifestation of God to come here seems so damned colloquial. So what it has done for me is to say that there's something much bigger out there. There's a bigger story out there. There are bigger things going on than humanity and our life on this little planet. Maybe it's all important to us because this is all we know, but I think there's a lot more out there.
Let me ask you this question then. Do you feel that folks like you, I mean, let's be blunt.
Sure.
If this were a few hundred years ago, we wouldn't have the conversation. I'd be sitting in the town square watching you burning at the stake.
Exactly.
Now, probably I'd be burning on the stake next to your stake.
Which one of us would be singing and which one would be screaming? There's a big question.
That's right. Or maybe we'd be doing, remember Life of Brian by Monty Python? That
Yes, always.
Always look on the bright side of life. I love that scene.
Yep.
And the best part was the Suicide Squad. It was really...
Yes.
Anyway, Monty Python aside, though.
When life serves up your gristle, just pucker up and whistle. So, yeah, that's where we are.
And they had it. So you are delving into these things, and this information has come forth. Now, I have to tell you, I mean, I look at the teachings of Yahweh and Christianity, and if I don't see it connect, I see there's a whole invention of interpretation, because for me, Yeshua was born, raised, died a Jew.
Yes.
And he was talking to Jews, basically just kicking them in the butt.
Right.
And you could boil them down into 4 simple words for a simple statement. 4 words. That's it, the alpha and omega of everything he was doing and what he thought about and what he wanted for us, and that's just simply stop thinking like slaves. So now my question to you is, that was the seed of consciousness that I see Yeshua planted.
All right.
Are people like you the fruit of that tree?
Yeah, I would say you've just introduced a new way to look at it for me, but I would have to say yes. I remember I'm a big proponent of some of the oddball apocryphal books and oddball writings and teachings out there because I want to know. I want to know where they came from, why they're there, and why they weren't included. Why were there 60-plus different Gospels and only 4 of them appear in our Bible? So I look at things like the Gospel of Judas, where according to that Gospel, at the Last Supper, Jesus takes Judas aside and says to him, you are the one who gets it. You're the only one who understands the deeper, darker mysteries, and that's why I must ask you to do what I'm going to ask you to do.
Thanks. Sounds like a great graduation present.
It sure does until you see the outcome of it all.
Yeah.
I believe that, yes, Jesus started something. I would never have brought it back to him, but in the context of what you're thinking, yeah, something started here. You got to think bigger. You got to think, what did Jesus say he came to do? He came to save the lost. He came to liberate the soul. And I believe that too much of our religion, too much of our spirituality captivates us in that negative sense of the word. It imprisons us. And I did not set out to write a book about philosophy or systematic theology. I set out to write a book about the facts as I saw them. And it turned into a book that spoke to these other things to say, look, do not be bound. If I could say there's one message I would bring out, the esoteric message of my book would be, Do not let anybody tell you what to think. Do not let anybody govern what you believe. You go out and dig that out and root it out. It takes work, and it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes passion. But until you do that, you are swallowing somebody else's words. And don't live that way when there is so much more there. And all that proved to me as I researched this book was that a whole lot more exists than what I thought existed. And I would never have known it if I hadn't looked for it.
That's right. And I think it gives great majesty to that seed of consciousness, which it couldn't be killed, couldn't be controlled, although they had millennia to attempt that.
Right.
But I see this knowledge coming around people who are waking up. And when I say that, stop thinking like slaves, how do slaves think? Slaves do what they're told to do. They all sit there and wait for the master to come home, and they're going to go, aha, I got it right, you got it wrong, I get to watch you get an ass whooping.
Right.
They squabble amongst themselves. They steal. They do all of this self-centric nonsense. But if, on the other hand, you're viewing yourself as co-creator and not as a slave, it puts a completely different spin on it.
It certainly does.
With that in mind, let me ask you a hypothetical, because when you're talking about the Nephilim, for my listeners out there, one question is lurking in the back of their minds is, what happens if there's a return of the Anunnaki?
Right, right.
Now, if there is a return of the Anunnaki, my guess on it is they show up, it's shock and awe, they just scare the piss out of us.
Right.
After which, they take all the gold and all the women they want and scoot, and following which, we just are beset by natural disasters that are going to wreak havoc for the planet. But let's look at that assumption that they come for golden women. The gold, fine, take it. What about the women? Would you say, okay, we should sacrifice some of our women to appease them, or would you say, no, you're not going to take our women, you're not going to take our men, you're not going to take anybody, get lost? Would you stand up and fight the good fight, or would you look the other way for the sake of convenience?
I think if it came down to being a thing of something against our will, I would like to think that I would be the kind of person who says, even though I'm too old to go into the military, if our nation was attacked by another nation, what would I do? Where would I stand? I would like to think that of myself. I think I view myself as being very patriotic, and my patriotism goes beyond words. I believe it would be something that I would put action to what it took to defend my country and defend my family and defend my neighbors.
Let's just... Scotty, we're getting more interference, and I'm hearing it come through.
All right. Want me to just jump right into it?
Yeah, let me kind of get to this one focus point.
Okay.
I see where you're going, but let's say, for example, it's not so clear-cut that the Anunnaki come, they want to take the gold and the women, and we're fighting them. What happens if it's presented to us in some sort of a fait accompli matter? In other words, saying, we need to do this. Our institutions are telling us that it's okay to do this, that it's okay to sacrifice these women to this cause, that for some higher aim, maybe they're going to take a faith to the stars or some other thing. So if it's coming from institutions that it's okay to give the Anunnaki the gold and the women, and the institutions are saying that, are you going to say, no, I'm going to be a Jedi rebel, I'm going to fight this? Answer me.
Well, let me think about that for a second. I would say, first of all, I love playing in hypotheticals, and I love playing with fictional stories. I love that kind of stuff, in addition to the research I did. So I would say it's so hypothetical, I got to wrap my mind around it for a second. But I would say I would like to be somebody that would do the same thing that I would do if it happened to the United States of America and we were attacked by a foreign power. I would like to stand for my country and fight for my country.
But what if your country's telling you not to stand and fight for your country? What if your country's telling you no? This is, hey, what do we see with globalism? Look at what's happening in our presidential campaigns. It used to be your donations would make a difference in terms of who was going to get elected. Now it's like you got all these billionaires that are coming in. It's a high-stakes poker game. Politics now reminds me of Las Vegas. You know, you got those baccarat rooms with the guys wearing the tuxedos. You know you're not going to walk in there with flip-flops and get serious attention.
Right.
Okay?
Well, I think You know,
it's a tough question, isn't it?
It is, because it's one of those that makes you speak and think more, either more highly of yourself than you ought, or not as big as you think you should. I would say that I would want to be that kind of person that would be consistent with what I believe now, and say if that inevitable question or courses of action were ever thrust upon me, I would like to say that I would stand for what I believed was right and true. If that meant sacrifice, it meant sacrifice. How would I react if you put an added wrinkle on there? How would you react if your kids were the ones being held at stake?
Oh,
what would I do?
You got ahead of me because I was going to drop that one on you too.
What if it was my daughters?
That's right. You know, it's always easy to sacrifice the virgin. Kind of hard on the virgins and a little hard on the families.
Right.
But it always seems to work for the ruling elites. I mean,
right.
Honest to God, the more I look at this thing, I see this big Machiavellian picture forming in my mind with this whole notion of the Anunnaki returning. I mean, it'll be shock and awe, golden women, period. Okay? But what if, in advance of all of that, they're already doing a little bit of work ahead of the game? You know, this is like a poker game, and somebody's sitting there and they're holding a good hand, but you can bluff them into folding, you still win the game with a hand that won't win.
Right.
So the thing here is, if the institutions are already being set up to facilitate this abduction of women, and your family's involved,
yeah,
would you say, let me ask somebody about this, or would you say, hell no, get lost, get your hands off our women, get your hands off our men, get your hands off our children, we're here, we're working the claim, bug out?
Well, what did one famous man in our own American history say? He said, shall peace be sacrificed at the price of chains and slavery? He said, forbid it, Almighty God. I don't know what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Now, you would like to think I would like to be that heroic and that noble in my thinking, but I would have to say, if I were forced, if my hand was pushed into something where it's the life of my children, the life of the people around me, I would most definitely take a stand. And of course, this is the stuff that right now in our minds is the stuff of science fiction. Because we don't see this happening right now, but you start to look at the world and the politics of the world and you wonder where we're headed. You start looking at all the things that are laughed at out there and conspiracies laughed at in alien arenas. And you start to look at this all and say there's either a big picture that's taking place or it is all just the stuff of fiction. And that's what's so hard to decipher. So on that very hypothetical side, I would like to think that I would do what I would do in any case. If my family were, my country, or my life, or the people, my neighbors were threatened, I would stand for them and I would stand against the tyrants. That's the way I think.
Now, another question. Do you feel that by this line of inquiry, you haven't stepped out of dogma and doctrine?
All right.
You burned the house down and walked away.
Yeah.
From their standpoint, okay?
From their standpoint.
From their standpoint. But would you trust yourself, having gone through this personal search for truth? You've written a book, and it's really about your personal search for truth. Has this enabled you to understand and to call the bluff?
I think so. I've thought about that.
Then that makes your knowledge dangerous.
Maybe so.
It makes your knowledge dangerous to who's running the bluff.
And there you go. And, you know, I cannot say that there have not been times in my thinking of this thing over the months and the years where the tendrils of the old theologies slip in, the old doctrines say, you are tampering with the stuff of the devil, you know, and back off. And, you know, and I can say that I faced that. That's internal strife, internal struggle.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying I've hit kind of a new paradigm in the things that I'm thinking, and it's either there's something to it or there's nothing to it. It's flip side of a coin. I am either a reprobate, a heretic, and a backslider, or I've stumbled upon something that's new, but it's nothing new because it comes right out of the old.
Mm.
I don't incorporate a lot of imagination into this. That's why I took great pains theologically to stay within the theological substructure, because I did not want to wander out of that and say, I've made up this thing I think about God, and therefore I'm going to believe that now. And I think, by the way, that is one of the big dangers we all have, I think theologically, is saying, I think this way or I feel this way. Nothing wrong with those things until you have no basis in it or no basis for what you believe anymore. And so I say, if you're going to feel something or believe something, know what the hell you feel and what the hell you believe and why you believe those things. And if you're going to stray from something that may have been the norm, know why you believe that. Bring it down to the illustration of our country. If our country took the wrong turn and you wanted to stand against that turn, you better know what the hell you're talking about and why you believe what you believe.
That's right.
To be a revolutionary, do you think, I remember when my kids were little and I let them watch movies with me like Saving Private Ryan and Braveheart, and I remember the movie The Patriot. And there was a scene where the colonial army had a couple of representatives coming into a church and announcing, "Pardon us, minister, we would like to announce to your church we're raising arms." And I said to my kids, I said, how would you feel if we were sitting in church one day at the big old such and such evangelical free church on the corner of Main and 7th, and we're sitting in church, and all of a sudden a couple of guys with machine guns walked in and said, "Pardon us, pastor, we want to talk to your congregation. We're raising arms against the United States government. Would you come in with us?" And I said, that brings it down to the practical. You know, what would you do if that really happened? And you have to say, I have to know what I believe if that moment ever came. Same thing with all of this stuff about doctrine versus spirituality versus theology. You got to know what you believe. But I think that knowing starts with questioning. It starts with curiosity. Like, starts with seeking knowledge. What do they say? Wisdom is applied knowledge. It's the outcome of applied knowledge. And so you say, how do I get to wisdom about these things? It's having curiosity, asking the questions, sticking my neck out, asking the questions, maybe even turning my back or closing the door or moving into another room, figuratively speaking, of my theology or the things I've always believed, and saying there might be something more to this or something different to this, but I'm not going to go there just because I want some whimsy of thinking of something different. I want to go here because I'm finding out there is something different.
Okay, final question. Now, I find a lot of doctrinal thinkers, and I'm talking about religion and science. Science has a lot of golden cows. But with doctrinal thinkers, there's always a curiosity. So they walk out to the edge of their belief systems, and they look over the edge to see what they see. And most will do that and run right back to the center of their belief systems and crazy glue their butt with 4 gallons of crazy glue, and that's it. But then there's a few that get out to the edge and just say, you know, I'm going to go parasail this. You jump off.
Oh, right.
You obviously parasailed. And final question, has this given you a greater sense of inner peace and connection with life, everything that's around you, than you had before? Are you more or are you less peaceful inside as a result of this knowledge?
I am more peaceful in the sense that I feel like I'm discovering something. But just like the people who discovered the New Worlds, Columbus, not even Columbus, go back here earlier than even him, there was this great joy, ecstatic piece about discovering something, but then there was that fear of stepping that first step onto that shore and out into that jungle, not knowing what's there. So I think, to me, I've discovered the New World. Have I explored the New World to its fullest yet? Nope, that's going to take time. So there is peace and there is joy and there's a lot of fun, but at the same time, there's great intrepidation that I do it the right way and that I don't just go with whimsy, that I go with what I can establish.
That's right. The more you know that you don't know.
That's right. That's a saying we've had for a long time around here. The more I know, the more I don't know, fill in the blank.
I think the best way to explain who and what is an independent thinking researcher is just ask them, and the answer is always going to be the same. How come I always keep feeling like I'm the last guy to know?
Yeah. I think that's part of discovery, you know.
Yeah.
And frankly, if I can speak theologically,
yeah,
I don't think God's given us all the answers. I think there's certain things that are absolutes in Scripture, but I also think that there are things that God said, there it is, go play.
Go dig.
Go dig.
If you want to be in my sandbox, you got to dig.
There it is.
All right. That's a good note to end it on. I look forward to the next time we get together. This has been a really great interview.
Thanks. It's been a lot of enjoyment for me in this too. I appreciate it. Even the varied stoppages of our show, the interruptions, the statics, and all that, and it made it fun. It made it worth. Damn it, I'm going to finish this.
Yeah, we're just going to push through. You know, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead.
There it is.
All right, Scotty, you beamed me up big time today.
Fantastic.
I had to drop that one on you.
Thanks.
Tonight we're going to dive into a topic that we've been covering before, the Anunnaki. And our guest tonight is going to be Scott Allen Roberts, and he's the author of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, The Untold Story of Fallen Angels, Giants on the Earth, and Their Extraterrestrial Origins. Now, as we get into this, what I would like to start off by doing is let's just read some passages from the Bible. And before I do that, I want to preface this. I find there's an interesting correlation between Scotty, we're going to be listening to tonight, and Zecharia Sitchin. I knew Sitchin personally on a professional level. We worked on a few things together. And both of these men were well advanced in their theological training. They were at, the equivalent of a seminary for both sides. And both of them hit the brick wall with their teachers and their institutions when they began asking questions about the Nephilim. It was just one of those, you don't do that kind of deals. And consequently, both of them went on a journey of exploration. Now, what really got them? All right, well, I'm going to read this to you because I think it's interesting. And frankly, I'm reading straight from the page on Wikipedia of all places. And here they say the term Nephilim occurs just twice in the Hebrew Bible, both in the Torah. That first is Genesis 6:1-4, immediately before the story of Noah's Ark. Let me read this. When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Operative word, any of them that they chose. Women obviously didn't have much of a voice in this. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The second reference is in Numbers 13:32-33, where the Hebrew spies report that they have seen fearsome giants in Canaan. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Wow. So, bottom line, the Bible's telling us that they go, yo, babe, you're mine, and that's it. I mean, it's right out of the caveman school of matrimony. Beat the woman on the head with a club, drag her into your cave, and bells will ring. All right? I'm sure you ladies out there are going, no, I don't really think that's how it works. All right. But the thing here is that when you talk about the Nephilim, you cannot help but talk about the Anunnaki, and that really brings us to the gist of what we're going to be doing here tonight, is that we're going to be talking about the Anunnaki. And a lot of folks have asked me over the years, why is it that I've really been focused on the sciences around proving the existence of Planet X, Nibiru, Destroyer, Frightener, it's got a lot of different names, and why I have sidestepped, for the most part, the issue of the Anunnaki. Well, I can tell you the principal reason was, while Sitchin was alive, I just considered it to be his pigeon. That was his ballywick, and leave him be to it. On the other hand, there was something else that I noticed, and it made me less interested in joining into the conversation, which seemed about competing ideas of who they are, the Anunnaki and the Nephilim. Is, for me, it always boils down to a real simple question. Once the music stops, who's left without a chair? Now, if we go back and we listen and read and investigate everything about the Anunnaki and the Nephilim, two things we know for sure. gold, and women. Women, mentioned very clearly, all right, in the Bible, just as I've read it to you. Gold we know about also because it's what they use to repair their atmosphere. Now, for those of you out there going, gee, how can gold repair an atmosphere? Gold is a natural radiation shield. It's very good at it. If you look at our spacecraft that are out in space, they have a very thin gold foil. All right, and that gold foil has a tremendous amount of capability to resist radiation. If you look at a picture of an F-16 fighter, it's got a big bubble canopy that really gives the pilot an incredible view. But also these are high-flying jets. And so you'll notice that the canopy of an F-16 has a golden tone to it. It's because when they form the plexiglass, they actually embed gold into it so that the radiation that the pilots are getting at high altitude is not going to turn them into a big pile of cancer. So there's a real reason for having the gold. And obviously there's a reason for having the women. You know, I mean, if we like Earth women, why wouldn't someone else? It seems to be a popular thing in the movies. And so I came across Scotty's book, and I have really been fascinated with how guys like Scotty get started, and they not only hit the brick wall inside of an institution, but then they push through that and they write a book, and they go start and talking about it, and they find an audience. It's quite an amazing thing. The curious thing for me is, why is it that even though this is mentioned directly in the Bible, in the Torah, this is a taboo topic for both Christians and Jews? Sitchin, you know, he hit the wall with his religious training, and that's what got him going down the same route that Scotty did, and Scotty had it. Now, Scotty doesn't agree with Sitchin on quite a few things. He's got his differences. Hey, that's fine. You know, if everyone was in lockstep, well, then we'd be looking like Nazi Germany if we were all in lockstep. And that's the beautiful thing about democracy. We can and do disagree with each other, and we agree to do it in a civil manner. So as we get into this, I want to explain to you that when I record my interviews, I do them offline because it gives me a really good chance to get into a lot of depth with my guests. There will be a lot of comments that I'm doing when we're recording the session that I take that out. It's superfluous for you. But you get everything the guest is saying, other than maybe I take out an occasional stutter. But whatever the guest is saying, it's 100%. You get all the words. Me, I trim down. That's getting progressively easier, too. But anyway, when we started recording this, and Scotty has his own radio show, both of us have professional studios, and we're very, very well adept at working with all the bandwidth issues and working with Skype and connectivity and getting a recording. And what we found was that this topic, which is really going to be talking about women and gold, seemed to have drawn the ire of someone, and we were getting hammered again and again and again, 5 times, actually 6 times during the recording session, that we were being disconnected, not only on Skype, but then we tried doing it on landline phones, AT&T, good old POTS, you know, plain old telephone system. We were getting slammed there. And so it was Scotty's idea to just, hey, you know, this is weird stuff. It doesn't happen to him. It happens to me. But he said, hey, let's incorporate it into the show. So now when you hear this dial tone, I'll play this for you. All right. When you hear that in the recording, I'm actually putting that in so that you can tell when the show's been interrupted. Doing Skype, we don't have the dial tone issue. So with that, I am going to get right into it. And I see that there's a great active group out there in the virtual chat room. Oh, yeah, I can't wait to get in there and mix it up with y'all in the chat room. So in the meantime, hey, let's get go. Rise and fall of the Nephilim. Scott, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me, Marshall. Good to be here.
That's good to have you here because I'm getting more and more interested in this Nephilim story all the time. And your book is very challenging for people who have a purely biblical view, but it goes to the heart of the question. Does the Bible support the ancient alien theory? And For me, it's not so much about what's there, but what's not there. To me, the whole story of the Nephilim is like a picture puzzle. You know, you get it out of the box, you spread out all the pieces on the coffee table, and the first thing you do is you get those four corners, and then you work your way in. The problem is for doctrinal thinkers, people that are very limited in what they're allowed to read and think about it, for them, it's like trying to work that same puzzle, but with only one corner piece.
Right.
And the other three are hidden in another room, maybe even in another house, in another neighborhood, on another planet, in another reality, in another dimension. Okay.
I can go along with that.
Okay. I just had to be dramatic for a moment.
Absolutely.
But you're, to me, somewhat of a Gnostic thinker. You just follow the truth wherever it takes you. And yet you come from very, very conservative roots. So before we get into the interview itself, let's tell the listeners about your history and what brought you to write your book.
Well, first of all, I like to challenge orthodox thinking, especially the kind of orthodox thinking about the Bible that I was raised with. Not just because I was some kind of rapscallion who needed to question everything and some kind of angst-ridden rebel, but I wanted to know answers to certain questions. And it seemed to me, in my very conservative fundamentalist Baptist teaching and training, those answers weren't forthcoming. As a matter of fact, it almost seemed at times as if questioning deeply was deeply discouraged. And take, for instance.
But you were a Bible teacher, weren't you? Or you were training to be one?
I was in Bible college, and I went to seminary, and I didn't finish either degree. Funny, you wonder how I got into my master's program without having my bachelor's degree. It's too long a story to get into. But I had about 6 years collective training, and I went into youth ministry. So I was working in churches, working with high school youth and junior high school youth. You know, when you're in those things, you're mostly talking about, you know, daily life and how to live daily life and things like this, youth ministry.
Right.
And at the same time, there were questions that I had about the theologies that I was even teaching and passing on. And when we were kids, if you were Judeo-Christian, you learned about, let's take the best example because it ties into the topic, the issue of Noah and the ark. Right. We all heard the story of Noah. We all heard that God was going to destroy the world for its wickedness and wipe out all of mankind except for the one pure man that was left, and that was Noah, his family, and we know the story from there. What we don't get taught ever, it seems, and even with my Bible college training and my seminary training, the touches on this topic were so scant as for me to even remember ever being taught them. That is the preamble to the whole flood story in Genesis chapter 6, which talks about, and the sons of God descended to the earth and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And they were known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old, the men of renown.
Is that the part when Bible class, when you start talking about it, you'd say, and then there was the and moving right along?
Pretty much.
Is that how you guys handle it? Okay, good.
Pretty much. You know, when I think about it, too, when you've got a second, third, or fourth grader sitting in a Sunday school class on Sunday morning, and the teacher is teaching the story of Noah and the ark with felt storyboards and little Noah with the beard and the stick and the robes and so on, you've got nobody teaching you about some kind of non-human entity that descended to the earth and had sex with human women, bequeathing the race that actually was the thing that was prompting the flood once you start digging into the passage.
Okay.
So for me, it really goes back to questioning the orthodoxy of the passage. Now, I will say right off the bat that I have no desire to dissuade anybody from what they believe religiously, spiritually, denominationally. That's not my point here. My point is to dig in and find out what the passage says. And you know what happens so many times? We find out that we're taught one thing in church or in synagogue, and when you start digging into the text and seeing what it says a little bit deeper, people don't want to hear it because it challenges what they've been taught. Because sometimes you get a much different picture when you start digging a little bit below the